Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's event on planning the post-COVID city. I'm Michael Hendrix, Director of State and Local Policy. COVID-19 struck a blow to America's cities. Streets and subways emptied out, offices and apartments went dark. But the pandemic also proved to be a time of incredible experimentation in urban form. We just witnessed the stunning rise in outdoor dining and open streets. In this hardship, this time of pandemic has also given us a chance to rethink the urban form from the ground up. That kind of begs questions that we're going to discuss today. How should we plan for the post-COVID city? What lessons should we learn for the past year? We have an incredible panel coming up to discuss this. Before we dive in, have your questions ready, enter them onto whatever platform you're watching us on, and I'll wrap them in as we go. All right, so today, thrilled to be joined by, first up, Aggarwala, Senior Urban Tech Fellow at Cornell Tech, Senior Advisor at Sidewalk Labs and Adjunct Professor at Columbia University. Alain, Bertaud, Senior Fellow at New York University's Marron Institute. Laura Fox, General Manager and Director of City Bike at Lyft. And last but not least, Henry Gabar, State Staff Writer for Slate. Rit, I want to start with you. When we talk about planning, when I'm talking about planning, what I generally have in mind, just to define things at the beginning, is infrastructure in our public spaces. Let's think about New York's infrastructure and public spaces during the pandemic this past year. What's worked? What's worked really well? I mean, I'm thinking of turning to our sidewalks for dining, maybe how buses have been a critical lifeline. I've never been more grateful for parks. So what, Rit, has worked really well in our infrastructure and public spaces this past year?
Thanks, Michael. First of all, grateful to be here. So thanks for hosting. I think overall, a ton worked well, right? I mean, all the things you cited. I mean, we saw, when the weather was nice, we saw New Yorkers using their parks and open spaces in different ways. People actually using parks as offices, using our sidewalks as restaurants, doing a lot of experimentation, right? Which was, of course, the thing that worked well above almost anything else. And I will say the other thing that worked really well, even though we don't think about it as planning, neighbors worked really well. I mean, one of the things that I think we really saw was the extent to which dense urban living combined with high levels of safety leads people to help each other. And, Eric Kleinberg, right, wrote about this 20 years ago, and that I think became a major part of the story here. So all of it did. And then above all else, the reminder that the city is not Midtown Manhattan, but the city is actually the residential neighborhoods. That's what matters most. And we went on living without Midtown, right? And I think it's a fascinating thing for us to be thinking about going forward, which is how do we put the residential neighborhoods of the city first in our thinking around planning?
Laura, I mean, thinking about these residential neighborhoods, I think of one of the things that comes to mind are city bike stations. And I think of how successful cycling seems to have been. E-bikes are taking off. From your perspective, what's also worked this past year?
Yeah, I think that bikes were certainly a lifesaver for many folks. And we saw that, I think when you're looking at just some of the stats and data, 2020 was a really strange year to be in the transportation space, but bikes proved to be a resilient part of that infrastructure. So in May, for example, city bike ridership was down 18% compared to prior years, but the subway was still down 89%. And I think, later in 2020, we saw ridership about 20% higher than 2019, which is a pretty stunning figure when you think about the typical mix of our rider base. So typically we'd have about 80% of our usage be related to commuting, 20% leisure. That completely flipped last year during the pandemic as people were commuting less outside of essential roles and then kind of looking for more ways to get outside, whether that's exercise, leisure, an essential trip. And there's a couple of themes I would say that we saw that I thought were particularly interesting. One, that 20% of people who were still going to offices in terms of essential workers. So, while most folks were staying home, right, and stopping the spread of the pandemic, many people did have to go to work. At City Bike, we started a program called the Critical Worker Program that allowed for 33,000 essential and critical workers to have free memberships, free e-bike rides to make sure that they could get to and from their offices. We supported with valets to ensure that they could have a place to kind of park, pick up a bike. And as a result, we saw hospitals actually be number one in terms of our top ridership stations throughout the network. I think then you look at the other 80%, right, of the ridership, and really saw people prioritizing biking for some exercise, fresh air. I think in addition to hospital locations, we had, some of our stations along greenways be popular locations. We saw a 3x increase in what we call joy rides. So people picking up a bike from one location and returning it back to the same. And then we saw significant increases in ride time as people were kind of exploring other modes. So up to double at some points of last year. And in total, ride times were up about 30% year on year. And then we also just saw, a third trend around more people trying bikes for the first time, which is incredibly exciting. So we had about 600,000 people try City Bike for the first time. We had about 900,000 unique riders in total. And exciting for me in particular, since this has been a big part of my mission since joining City Bike, was 49% of those 600,000 people were women trying biking for the first time. And so I think, happy to come back to some of those gender points later, but starting to see some really interesting things happen as we think about and explore access for more people. And then to your point, e-bikes are probably the biggest story of the year, and really seeing what that means for folks, especially when you think about taking longer trips, folks who wouldn't have been able to take those trips otherwise. At City Bike, we have a fleet of about 5,000 e-bikes, which is about 20% or so of our fleet. And we've seen ridership, despite them being 20%, be about 40% of total ridership, which is incredible. And those e-bikes being used, 3 times or more per day. And so when I think about what worked for mobility, I think, biking continues to be one of those stories. I think when we think about, what comes next, like that's something that I'm really excited to engage on in this conversation, because we know that a City Bike station for an equivalent parking space facilitates, 27 to 30 trips per day. There was a great Transportation for London study that came out that showed that bike lanes are 5 times more effective than a vehicle lane. And there's other studies that show something similar or more. And as we think about what comes next, and I'm sure Alain will speak to this, but his point around cities as labor markets and transportation about facilitating access, right? Investing more in some of the infrastructure that empowers those modes is going to be really important. We've seen the future, now we just have to truly facilitate that.
Well, that's a great tee up for Henry, but it is fascinating, Laura, just how much mobility tells the story of the pandemic, both good and bad. You have frontline workers, critical workers, still having to go into work, often risking their lives. You have the demand to be at hospitals for good and bad reasons. Quite often bad, but also a change in where people go, why they're moving around, and maybe changes that will last in terms of how we commute and go about our lives. So Henry, to you on streets, this is something that you've been thinking a lot about, writing about. You're writing a book. How have you seen the streets change? I remember during the depths of the pandemic, we're talking March, April last year, the streets of New York completely emptied out, but it wasn't just New York. It was most stunning, I think, in New York, considering how many people normally are there. This amazing transformation from completely full streets to empty streets, and then to something different where you had open streets, outdoor dining, different uses of parking. Same question to you, Henry. What have you seen work really well this past year?
Michael, it's a funny story because I went off to write my book about parking in the fall of 2019. And so I'm working on this book for Penguin Press. And one of the key premises here was based on living in New York. And you see all this land, and it's some of the most valuable land in the world, but we give it away for free or for basically quarters on the hour, provided you're willing to use it for just one thing, which is storing your automobile there. And so part of the reason I wanted to write this book was to demonstrate the potential for this space to be used for something else if we wanted to do that. And I do feel like the story of the monkey's paw, where a man wishes upon the monkey's paw and his wishes come true in the worst way possible. That's what the pandemic has been for me, because I'd been trying to convince people that this space could potentially be used for all manner of things that seem to be almost beyond people's imagination. And then you come back to New York this summer and this fall, and even this winter, in the depths of winter, We now have 7,000 restaurants operating in parking spaces. We have another 4,000 on the sidewalk, and obviously the open streets as well. So I think all in all, it's just been a complete reimagination of the public space. It's like, I feel like I'm in one of those Italo Calvino stories in Invisible Cities, where the whole city's been turned inside out. Like all the old buildings were declared obsolete. And so we had to build new ones in the available space, which was right in front. So every restaurant has a sort of like funny COVID-friendly mirror image that's been constructed in front. And some of them, as I'm sure you all know, are quite sophisticated. And I think this is here to stay. So I'm excited about that.
Well, and one thing that we can get to as well is how we can, for the things that did work and how we used our street space, ensuring that they do stick around. Just before we jumped on this call, I saw on Twitter David Zipper, big mobility expert, was sharing a survey of mayors, many of whom were saying, no, we're going to turn the streets back to cars. And they said, well, the funding's just not there. But David also suspected maybe there's a certain friendliness toward driving that's still very latent. So we should get back to that too, on how we can ensure the things that work stick around. But let's put a pin in that. Alain, I want to get to you. Let's zoom out. We've talked about streets and infrastructure, but what has worked in our public spaces in built environment? Like what's excited you? Like, I don't know, more flexibility in housing, or where we could even think housing could be put, or the use of parks. What's really excited you?
I think that, for me, the major success is what Laura talked about transport. I think we were already before COVID at the eve of a revolution in urban transport, and it a certain way it accelerated it. And I'm not sure which mode will prevail, whether it's e-bike or something else, shared or not shared, I don't know. But I think that kicking the handtail was a good thing in terms of transport. So it accelerates progress. But you're asking about housing. For me, it might be a little too early to say, but I have the feeling that, in fact, in downtown area, rents are going down. Office space is more and more vacant. And that, again, was a trend, by the way, which was pre-COVID. For instance, in Wall Street area, there were more and more office building being converted to housing, including, by the way, the Woolworths building. So I think this is a good trend. Again, a mixed use, less, a land use less driven by arbitrary zoning and more by demand. So I hope that this demand stay. What I see also, which I have not seen mentioned yet, is that it will mean also a shift of generation. I see a shift of people. Older people were living in Manhattan, moving to the suburbs because they will commute maybe 1 or 2 days a week, and being replaced by a younger generation who can afford to live downtown. I think too, in terms of generation, if you are young, if you are, let's say, beginning your career, it's much more important to live in a dense city than a guy like me, although I enjoy dense city, but who have an extensive network of people, of friends, and can very well survive in a way, just using the internet. So the randomness of encounter, I think that is provided in the city is much more important for the younger generation than it is for the old. And in a way, because of the pricing of housing, the younger generation was excluded from the center. So, the downside is that if there are less office building, in a way, at the beginning, there will be, probably less coffee shop, or, people were using it for lunch. But on the other hand, if you have more residents, then it will compensate. There will be a gap in between. But the only problem I see there is the zoning, the rigidity of the zoning. Especially in New York, we are in a regulatory straitjacket. We have something like more than 200 commercial zoning district, which is crazy, which define exactly what you can do. And if really the city realized the need for having this flexibility in zoning, removing this false pretension of externality, if you replace a shoe store by a bar or something like that, there is no such thing. And I think that we'll have a very great potential. So on housing, again, I hope so far, when I've seen the rents have not really decreased, is that the people who are renting are giving 2 or 3 months, free rent, which is not quite the same. That means that they expect that the rents to be back to their old level. I hope not. And I hope that, especially if there are conversion of office building, that will be a new supply.
Alain, do you have any thoughts on remote work? This wasn't something I was necessarily planning on bringing up, but you have, as Laura mentioned, written on the city as a labor market as a way to define and understand the city. And if one of the biggest successes, I would posit it was, of the past year was remote work, going from roughly 5% pre-pandemic full-time remote work to something closer to 45 to 50%, incredible jump. Surely that affects in some way the urban form. So maybe remote work a success, but also mixed picture depending on which part of the city you look at?
Yeah, I mean, if you take it to an extreme, and if you assume that everybody will be happy to work full-time online, which I don't think will happen, but the first 3 or 4 months is fine. After 1 year, suddenly you realize, and I'm sure after 2 years, you realize you are missing a lot. So I still think that labor market imply face-to-face. Labor market implies also randomness of contact, and this randomness, so far, the technology is not giving us this randomness. And therefore, I think that there will be a necessity of face-to-face contact all the time. Whether, some firms will say you have to come once a week, other firms will say 3 times a week or full time. And then there will be, of course, don't forget that this is about probably about 40% of workers can be, let's say, working either full-time at home or say part-time at home. Quite a number of workers cannot. So where will they go? Will some of them move to the suburbs, where we're providing, say, lunch in Manhattan for office workers? Will there be new type of meeting space? This was, again, pre-COVID. I'm not sure. Again, for me at this moment, it's not to plan, but to get your ear to the ground to understand what is happening.
Well, and that's a great point. And I think it's a good transition to another part of our conversation. So we've talked about what's worked, but maybe we can tease out some lessons learned. So Henry, I do want to get back to what you're talking about on cars. Do you see cities still being shaped by cars and the storage of cars going forward? And maybe we can get back to how mayors can plan for that. But do you see some good lessons learned on how cities have been shaped by cars and could do that going forward?
Well, I don't like to think of it as a distinction really about like cars versus bikes, so much as the allocation of space and who it's going to. So I think there's been this tendency in New York politics to think of infrastructure for people and bikes as being somehow like a bourgeois amenity that's designed for hipsters on bicycles going to the cupcake shop or whatever. And it's as if the people who say stuff like that can't see the thousands of largely immigrant delivery workers who are bringing them their takeout, or people working for Amazon, Whole Foods. Like, a lot of this stuff is happening on bicycles, a lot of the delivery gig economy stuff. And that is true of outdoor dining as well. I think you've seen hundreds and hundreds of restaurants open in places like the Bronx, outer Queens, central Brooklyn, And what that shows is that the previous system for allocating space was serving as a major obstacle for some communities to access something like outdoor dining. There's no reason that outdoor dining should be something that is a domain of only the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan, and it's not anymore, and I'm glad to see that. But to take it back to cars, I think the take I would, the message I would give to people who drive in New York is that if we could redesign the system in a way that prioritized the most important trips, which is to say deliveries, commercial vehicles such as locksmiths and plumbers, those drivers would have an advantage in a system where car storage were more wisely allocated, shall we say. Garbage trucks would have an advantage. So those are domains where I think that we can, it's not necessarily a question of rethinking just getting rid of cars altogether, but it's saying which of the vehicle trips that are the most important ones, which are the ones that we want to prioritize, that we want to make as easy as possible, and which ones do we want to attempt to discourage, namely people driving to work alone. And I think congestion pricing might help with that.
Well, I mean, and that's a great point, because as you pointed out, there are some amenities that have been offered during this pandemic that are classified almost as bourgeois amenities. And yet, as you pointed out, it could be someone who's a delivery rider on the back of a bike using a bike lane. It's not just someone who's well paid, well educated using that. This is something that's accessible to everybody. Same for some of the other amenities that we've seen. And there's still a lot more that we can be doing about that now shared road space. I mean, Laura, I don't know if you've been seeing this, but there's been seems like a concerning increase in pedestrian deaths over this past year too. I mean, surely this is also like a lesson learned about how we can use that space better, prioritize how we want to use it, and keep people safe.
Yeah, definitely. My team jokes that the best way to get me fired up and ready to go, as Obama would say, would be to talk about the curb and parking and the limited amount of space given to people on our streets. So this is a topic that's really hits home for me. And just to build on what Henry was saying, and maybe starting with some data, and this may be preaching to the choir a little bit, and this pulls on a lot of the work that RIT did at RPA as well. But when we look at our streets, 75% of space today is allocated to vehicles. And then, the rest is essentially a little bit of crumbs, right? So there's, I think, 0.2% of car-free bus lanes. There's 0.98% bike lanes, and then sidewalks are largely the rest. And kind of to build on one of the points that Henry was making, all of those parked cars, there's 3 million parked cars in New York City. That makes up the space of 11 central parks, and all of that parking is free. And so some of the points that Henry was making around congestion pricing, I agree with. And I also think that there is a real opportunity when we think about reallocating that space at the curb and charging for use of the curb in ways that we haven't before, and treating that as it really is a public amenity rather than a private amenity. And I think, cities have a lot of problems with revenue generation. I think it's the thing that's top of mind for just about every mayor of, I have these ambitious programs that I want to run. How am I going to fund them? And what does that look like? Or I haven't been able to maintain my existing infrastructure. Where could that revenue come from? And just as a back of envelope, when you look at those amount of parking spaces, if you were to say charge for 50% of them, and that's a random number, there would actually be some work required to say, where are there parking spaces that are close to transit and real alternative modes versus transit deserts should certainly be excluded from, being charged for curb use. And say we assume that 50% of the time those spaces are occupied, and when they're occupied, you charge $1 per use. That's $7 billion per year, just from a very top-down estimate that cities could be generating. And I've nerded out on this with, Stephen over at Quard about what their models would suggest. And based on commercial loading zones and others, their estimates are more like, 20 billion a year. And so this is really a big opportunity. And so I think that there's a lot of room to allocate street space away from vehicles, think about how we actually create more efficient uses of the street. And by doing so, think about how that leads to more protective environments for people who are riding. To your point, where you began, Michael, there have been a 50% rise in deaths from vehicles from last year as, vehicle speeds increase and people were using the street in more dangerous ways. And we have the ability to change that through real infrastructure and through reallocating space.
I imagine if Donald Shoup, the author of The High Price of Free Parking, was watching, he'd be very happy about this conversation. Rit, what do you think about this conversation on both congestion pricing, but especially better pricing parking as part of reimagining our streets more holistically going forward?
Well, I think, look, I've been a proponent of congestion pricing since Plan YC in 2007. So nobody is going to jump at the idea of pricing bad uses more quickly than I am. And I think I wholeheartedly agree with Laura that it's not just about pricing the trip, it's also about actually pricing the parking, as Henry also pointed out. But I will say one thing that, you cited David's article. More broadly, I think one of the things that's at risk a little bit over the next couple of months is the knee-jerk return to normal, and it's not just on our streets. One of the things I'm working on right now for Cornell Tech is an idea around is a project to recommend how urban technology should be used by the next mayor and city council. And one of the things that I'm seeing clearly is community boards here in New York have always been a problem because they are unrepresentative, right? They skew white, they skew rich, and they skew old in every neighborhood, right? And it's one of the reasons that neighborhoods, as transportation alternatives shows us, they want less parking, they want better uses of the curb, they want more bike lanes. Community boards, you would think, hate them, right? Over and over again, right? It's because they're unrepresentative. By moving online, what we've seen is actually much broader participation because people who have kids at home or people whose lifestyle doesn't allow them to be at a specific place at 6:30 or 7 o'clock on a weeknight have been able to go. There's a problem though, because the people who are in charge of making those decisions, frankly, they really liked the older way. And so the knee-jerk reaction is going to be quickly to go back to normal. And I think, many of us are longtime New Yorkers, we've forgotten that in the aftermath of 9/11, we closed the Holland Tunnel for a year, right? A fantastic example of how the city was fine, right? And we could have rethought of that as a busway. We could have reimagined all sorts of uses for that piece of infrastructure. But instead, we quickly went back to normal because everybody thought that was a victory. And so I think it's not just on the streets. I think it's in a number of ways that we actually have to really intentionally preserve what we've learned that has worked.
And I mean, of course, one of the things that we learned along the way was 14th Street becoming a busway did not prove to be a disaster either. In terms of lessons learned, I also wonder, Rit, if you could weigh in on transit. So we've talked about more people picking up biking, clearly more people, a lot of people walking around in the neighborhoods, all that's great, but we saw just catastrophic declines in ridership on subways, 80 something percent on subways, and still just very, very high compared to a year or so ago, 90% in the range of commuter rail. Is this an epochal shift, or is it just kind of smoothing out ridership? And so as people come back to the subway, we won't get these kind of rush hour spikes. I mean, what do you see as a lesson learned for transit going forward?
I think it's actually a very big shift that will be with us for a long time. I think it's going to be very difficult for the transit agencies to shift, but I think the ones that do will actually find that they are better. They are better economically, and they are providing better service. Among the things that Laura was talking about in terms of the shift in the way people are using the city bike system, it's kind of the same thing for the transit system, and in fact for the streets as a whole. I mean, one of the fundamental facts of the way we use our streets in Manhattan, in addition to parking, is the desire to get as many vehicles into the center, into Midtown as quickly as possible and out. And so those rush hour surges actually shape more than just the transit system. But as we move to a world in which a very high percentage of the jobs, particularly in a place like Midtown, don't have to be in the office every day of the week, as we move towards a world in which, whether it's 1 day, 2 days, 3 days a week, people are working from home, chances are there's also something of a smoothing of the peak. So not everybody is going to have to be at work at 9 o'clock, because that 9 a.m. meeting, maybe you take that one by video and you come in at 10, right? That's going to become a lot more normal. And what that means is you're no longer having those peaks, which are the problem. If we remember back, say, to 2019, like getting on the subway in October on a Monday morning, or a Tuesday morning, even more so, is really miserable when it's super crowded. And an August Friday, when there's only 10 or 15% of the people who don't go to work that day, the system works perfectly, right? Because it's that final load that actually breaks the system and makes it unpleasant. So I think what we actually see over the medium term is a really positive shift. You also have the opportunity, for example, to start rethinking how the system is used. I mean, we've heard finally discussion from here in New York, Metro North and Long Island Railroad, of saying, oh yeah, well, maybe we could actually not just run nonstop through the Bronx and Queens. Maybe we could make this infrastructure available to people who live in the 5 boroughs, because we're not going to have that many riders coming in every single day from Westchester or Nassau. The challenge and what we have seen is that it's a bit of a resetting of a bone, in the sense that the whole transit system has been built around that mission, and its economics and finances have been built around that mission. And that's what's been catastrophic. Right? And so we are going to have to rethink that a bit.
I mean, Alain, I wonder if you have some thoughts here on, the possibilities. Maybe it's a challenge, maybe it's also an opportunity to rethink the mission of some of our core transit. I'm also thinking of just how ridership on buses didn't decline as much as it did on subways and commuter rail. And of course, some of that may be related to fears, some of which were undue, about the transmission of COVID-19 in the enclosed space of a subway car versus being above ground in a bus. But nevertheless, buses are also potentially more convenient at serving neighborhoods that people are being or staying in. Do you see potential to rethink how we use some of our core transit?
I think that yes, buses are probably let's say underestimated in their potential for some reason. For instance, this rush for tramway or something, I think is not really justified. I see the example of Singapore, which more and more now are using express buses. That means a bus which stops 3 or 4 times in a given neighborhood and go all the way to an area which has a lot of jobs. It's not necessarily the downtown, could be the airport, could be, and so those express buses are extremely efficient, and in a way more efficient than a subway system with feeder buses, where you have to transfer from a bus to a subway and then a subway to another bus. And, the Singaporean, which are probably one of the best data with Beijing probably about transport, the day-to-day transport. I think that they come to this conclusion, and I wonder if that could not be used in New York. And by the way, I would like also New Jersey to be included in the zone, if possible, not the city. Politically, I'm not sure of that.
Which is where you are now. No,
but say one of the main things from the discussion before, and in particular Henry, is that there is a complete misallocation of the public space, the street space in New York. I don't think it's the cars are invading, like if they were a robot from outer space. There are people in cars and who are driving those cars. So I think that a new assessment of what vehicles are absolutely necessary. You need to feed a city like New York. You need an enormous number of trucks and electricians and plumbers. And this, so the idea of a street without cars is not right, I think. It's not a fight between bicycle and cars. It's a better allocation of space. The street space is it's a problem of real estate, and that's why again, congestion pricing makes sense, because congestion pricing recognize that the street space is a part of the real estate and should be priced like real estate.
That's a great point. And Laura, there's a question from the audience, and please keep the questions coming in. But I wonder if you have thoughts, kind of building what Alain was saying, on scooters. The question from Sam is, what's the opposition to scooters, and what are New York City's urban constraints with implementing these scooters? I wonder if you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think for scooters, I think that there's a couple of things. One, with the scooters that are inherently dockless, that's highly problematic in a city like New York City that has high foot traffic, high vehicle lane usage, and things like that. Street clutter matters here much more so than in other cities, and so I think that's one point. I think also there's a question of what's the transportation problem that you're trying to solve for as well. I think pre-pandemic, just from our own data within Lyft, because we operate a number of scooter markets in other cities, we saw, peaks, Rit was talking about peaks in usage, right? And in bike markets, we see traditionally, obviously not last year, but 2019, 2018 prior, peaks in the morning, peaks in the evening. So people are replacing their longest trip of the day with a bike, right? Versus for scooters, we see peaks around midday, which implies one of the dominant use cases, people going to pick up lunch or something like that, right? And peaks around things like holidays, right? For really dominant leisure use cases. So I think it's really a question to cities as well about what are some of the use cases that you're looking to optimize for, and what are the ways that you're going to think about how to create good use of street space that has high utilization.
That's a great point. And there's a ton of other great questions coming in. So I'm going to just kind of jump around. Henry, I want to get to you. There's a response when we talk about cyclists, pedestrians, the safety of both of those. There's sometimes a response to that saying, well, particularly from those who are primarily drivers, saying, well, is the problem the driver? Is the problem the car? Or is the problem the pedestrian that didn't look the right way in the street, or the cyclist who whizzed right through traffic and broke all the laws? How do you respond to that question? Are cars the entire problem?
That's a great question. I have an easy answer. The problem is the car. No, I kid a little bit. I really don't want to have it be some sort of competition for most vilified mode of transport. People always think that if we make things easier for people on foot, on bike, in buses, then that means life getting worse for drivers. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think if you look at places that have really well-developed bicycle infrastructure, you see cyclists obeying the rules. I don't think it's like a Danish or a German cultural trait that in cities where they have all these bike lanes, people wait at red lights. It's the feeling of, I'm existing in a system that's designed for me, and so I'm going to work within its rules. And right now, cyclists don't feel that way, and rightfully so, because so many of them die every year on these unprotected streets. So there's just a difference of magnitude between the damage that a car can do and the damage that a bicycle can do. But I would also say to drivers that, the city is not going to be able to scale up driving, right, where everyone uses a car. It's just not going to work. There's not enough space. It's just geometry. So I think that if you're somebody who really needs to drive for work, like let's say you drive an ambulance or something like that, it should be in your interest to see as many other people drop out of their cars as possible. And that's why I think that people who really need to drive to work would likely be in favor of things like congestion pricing, transit ways, and other ways to get people out of their cars. And let me finally say that the reason I keep talking about street space is not just because I think it's the most important thing or because I'm writing a book about it, although those are factors, but it's also the easiest thing. I mean, this is something that the city controls. We don't have to go to the state and ask permission to put some paint down or to put in a parking meter or something like that. There are some really thorny questions confronting New York going forward, which is like, what are we going to do with all this midtown office space if people don't come back? How do we solve the homelessness crisis? Those are really difficult questions. What to do with the streets? It just seems pretty straightforward to me that a couple minute changes and you could really make a better experience for virtually everyone who uses them. And going forward, as New York needs to be more competitive in its focus on quality of life, because we're no longer competing for firms renting 3 floors, we're competing for the workers themselves who could choose to live here or choose to live somewhere else. It's clear that there's just an enormous amount of opportunity there. I think Jeanette Sada-Khan used to say that she was New York's biggest real estate developer because 25% of New York is street space. So I think that's where a lot of opportunity lies.
And certainly this is a topic that can get people agitated. And as Jeanette knows very well, when you make changes to the streetscape, there's often there's a heated response, but also this remarkable tendency, not in every case, but a remarkable tendency of when the changes just are implemented. You just do it, or even just experiment in this kind of tactical urbanist kind of approach. People end up liking a pedestrianized Times Square, more or less, and people adjust how they drive. And bike lanes, people adjust around bike lanes and end up wanting to be protected. That, again, not universal, but once you bring out these changes, you discover that people do adapt and adapt more readily than you would think. Rit, I want to turn to you really quickly, but Alain, I'm going to give you a heads up. My next question is to you is about 15-minute cities and that notion. So that's a warning to you. But Rit, I want to get to one more audience question. I think it's an interesting one. It's about like Uber Elevate and these kind of aerial transportation solutions. We've been talking about flying cars. The joke is, we were promised flying cars and all we got were 140, now 280 characters. But now you do have Uber Elevate, you have Joby Aviation, you have all these other kind of schemes out there. Do you see I'll ask a broader question. Do you see different forms of transport and mobility breaking into the space and transforming cities in any way over the next 10, 20 years? Or do you find that forms of mobility are remarkably stable? The scooter is not exactly new. Do you just find it to be relatively stable and we should plan around what we are seeing in front of us right now?
So it's a good question. I think there are probably markets in which aerial vehicles will play a somewhat meaningful role, although I think there are very real constraints on what share you could imagine them fundamentally taking, right? Because at the end of the day, whether it's rooftops or landing sites, as with most high-speed modes of travel, the real problem in an urban area is not the line haul. The real problem is actually the last, in this case, it could be the last 100 feet, right? And how it's very efficient to have 5,000 people walk into the lobby of a skyscraper and take elevators up and down. How you manage the rooftop if you have 5,000 helicopters trying to come in and out, it's impossible to imagine, right? And therefore, I think you have the same issue that you have with cars. They're just in the air, which feels great when the skies are not crowded, but it'll feel just as bad. I mean, I'm sure you've got the power broker, both Henry and Michael in the background, as every good Zoom backdrop does. When the roads were empty, that seemed like a fantastic solution until they got crowded, and then you realized it isn't. However, on our streets, I think there's huge opportunity for significant changes over time, right? And we've seen it already. I mean, one of the challenges with our streets is that, you go back 25 years, there were 3 flavors of vehicle. There was the private car, or it could have been painted yellow in a taxi. There was a truck, and there was a bus, and that was all we had. And every now and then you'd have a delivery bike darting in and out, right? The universally vilified courier bikes, right? Who all got replaced by fax machines, of course. And now you've got shared bikes, which are very different vehicles from private bikes, as Laura well knows. You have the promise of scooters. You have people riding crazy one wheels and other things. What's on the horizon is even more exciting, I'd argue, because whether it's the neuro autonomous delivery vehicle or the Zoox autonomous vehicle, like, you have the potential for a whole new class of vehicles that are actually designed for an urban setting. Our trucks, our cars, our buses even are designed for highways. The safety specifications, the speeds, the sizes, et cetera, are all about how you optimize the highway use. And we have the potential, if we think differently about our streets, to find vehicles that are narrower, smaller, shorter. You could see over them, and they are speed regulated. So even if the electric motor can go 100 miles an hour, it's got a limit that says, well, hey, I know where I am. I know the speed limit here. Maybe in this bike lane or this new mobility lane is 15 miles an hour. So I'm not going to go more than 15 miles an hour. And that creates a whole new opportunity that isn't just about bikes, because I do think one of the challenges is we probably will see some maximum percentage of the population who really feels like they would ever use bikes for a variety of reasons, right? Some physical or some, just preferential, right? But once you can start thinking about moving cargo and having taxis or hailed rides in a similar vehicle that's going the right speed for an urban environment, et cetera, that really does have the potential to transform the urban streetscape and urban mobility.
It's a great point. And Alain, I warned you, now we come to 15-minute cities. It's actually a good tee up for that question. We've seen a lot of writing, a lot of thinking, a lot of talking about this notion of 15-minute cities. Tell us, just for viewers, what is it? And then what's your take on it?
So that was, I think, it was a platform of the current mayor of Paris before she got reelected. And it was supported by a professor of the Sorbonne, Moreno. The idea is that, and from the word of Moreno himself, that you could redesign a large city like Paris or London, but in this case it's Paris, and have everything within a 15-minute walk or bicycle. By the way, the area you can cover in 15 minutes, bicycling or walking, is not quite the same, but the emphasis is that on walking. So normally I bitch, against, objective which are not measurable. So for once, here is an objective which is measurable, 15 minutes. So what is objective here? Not only that you could have all the commerce or the facility you need within a 15 minutes walk, but also your work. So on the facilities, on the commercial area, as this apply only to Paris, the historical Paris, municipality of Paris, 2.5 million people out of 10 million. So the density in Paris is such that indeed within 15 minutes you can reach all sorts of bakeries, food shop, restaurant, bars. They have very good data on that, by the way. On 15 minutes, you cover more or less about 600 acres. So within 600 acres, I measured in Paris how many food store you can reach. For instance, I found that within this 600 acres, you could get 59 bakeries. So you can walk to 59 bakeries within 15 minutes. You can have, if you look at food store, 197 food store. So this is the objective is, the density of Paris, by the way, downtown Paris is about the same as, the West Village. And so you have basically within the 15 minutes radius, you have about 700,000 people. So that's enough indeed for any commerce to want to locate there if the zoning allows them. Now, let us look at jobs. This is a different thing. So, by the way, on this objective, it's very nice for a politician to have an objective which is already met. That I strongly recommend that. And on the other thing, the jobs. Well, if I look at commuting for people who live in Paris, in historical Paris, only 11% have a commute of less than 15 minutes. And that includes the people who work at home, pre-COVID. And the other commute between more than 15 to up to 2 hours. A large number commuting around 1 hour. So what does a municipality do about that? What do they mean by redesign? The labor code in France is already several thousand pages long. Do they add more pages to say that you can hire only people who live within 15 minutes from your enterprise? Or do you say for housing that you can take a job only within 15 minutes? I can imagine myself in Glenrock, New Jersey, if I was condemned to work at 15 minutes from my house. I'm not sure I could find a job, frankly. They would not want me as a cashier in a supermarket, probably. So here you see, we have the problem I have is that we have an objective. Paris is a serious city. It's relatively well run. Why would they invent something like that, which is like a flying carpet? There are a lot of problems in Paris, in cleanness, all sorts of things, traffic, of course, pollution, maintenance of monument. Why would they invent something like that, which is a non-starter? The government do not have any ability to provide jobs within 15 minutes of anybody. This was tried, by the way, by the Soviet Union, and even the Soviet Union at its heyday could not do it. So I can understand why people are attracted to it, but it's a bit like in transport. If you were saying, well, I have invented a flying carpet and everybody will have one, everybody will be happy. It doesn't pollute. It's comfortable, and you can store it in your basement. It's fine, but it's not serious. So this is not serious, but it's not the first time a non-serious idea is proposed.
Not at all. And it kind of that's a really great answer, Alain. This does kind of beg a question that I think can get us into the okay, so where do we go from here kind of question of how will we get serious leadership? How will we get serious leadership in planning? I think it's fair to say that you're optimistic about the future of cities. Will our institutions rise to the moment? Will they be able to separate out good ideas from bad, and how can we help them do that? I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
I think it's going to be, the next 2 years, I think, are going to actually test our municipal institutions in a way that we haven't seen them tested probably in our lifetimes. There's a huge opportunity both to reinvent a whole set of things, as we've discussed. As we all know, here in the United States, there's the prospect of a massive change in the level of funding that's available for infrastructure investments. And I think one of the biggest challenges that the United States faces across the board on many of these urban issues is that we as a country have failed to reinvent the institutions that make all of our decisions and manage our operations compared to basically anywhere around the world. East Asia and Europe over the last 30 years have changed all of their institutions, not always perfectly by any stretch. But, how old is the MTA in its current form? It's more than 50 years old, and it hasn't had any substantive change. TfL just celebrated TfL could finally buy a drink here in the United States, right? It's 21 years old as an institution, right? And we haven't done that. The Port Authority is about to celebrate its centenary. Really? The Port Authority in 1921, when the Port Authority was set up, you didn't have Glass-Steagall, you didn't have the Securities Exchange Commission. Corporations and the stock market were actually dens of corruption, right? And so the public authority was this fantastic, transparent way to make decisions. right? Now, of course, we know that the Port Authority is a really opaque, bad way to make decisions. Whereas, one of the things that MRTC in Hong Kong does, which is fascinating, is they incorporate it as a company. The Hong Kong government still owns the vast majority of the shares, so the board is fully appointed by the government. But you can buy a share not only in Hong Kong, but here in New York, which means that their decision-making is actually under the jurisdiction of the SEC. So you could buy a share, and if you think they've made a bad decision, you can sue them as a minority shareholder, right? I don't know whether that's the right model, but that's an example of the way that our institutions need to be reinvented here. Whether certainly it's too much to ask that they'll all get reinvented in the next 2 years, but I guess I can be optimistic that we're going to see both the successes and the disappointments in the post-COVID recovery may prompt or highlight the need for some of these changes.
Henry, with that in mind, the chance for institutional reform, what would be your message to New York's next Henry to the next mayor on what their planning priorities should be?
I would say do not chase after people leaving New York. I think that there's a very tempting possibility to watch these families move into the suburbs, which is a totally normal action in the course of an American life. You turn 35, 40, you got 2 kids, you move to a big house in the suburbs. That's a normal thing that's happening, but there's been this tendency in the news to look at it as if it's this kind of cataclysmic event for New York City, because we haven't seen our regular inflow of people moving here for jobs, for the arts, tourists, et cetera. So I would say that while there are many things that could be better about New York City, the essential bundle of amenities, quality of life, living without a car, these things that New York offers that really no other American city offers, that remains attractive and I think remains unique, and is potentially even an advantage in an era of remote work, because as many people there are who would love to move away from New York to Bozeman or Nashville, there may be an equal number who have been dying to live here their entire lives and have been working at some job that hasn't permitted them to do that until now. So I would encourage the next leader to stay the course to some extent. And I agree with Britt about institutional reform. $1.5 trillion in the hands of the Port Authority, I think, would buy us about 2 trains to LaGuardia Airport.
Going the wrong way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm both laughing and crying at the same time. Alain, same question to you. Thinking about what you've just heard and what you just said on 15 Minute City, what's your message on planning for the next mayor of New York?
You are going to be, he or she will be confronted with change, and the trend of the regulatory system in New York in the last 50 years have been to slow down and make any change extremely expensive. And I think they have to reverse that and allow a lot of change. Look at the zoning of the regulatory system in other cities of the world. New York is probably one of the most minutely regulated one. And I think that it's about time to review all these things. The things which were externalities in the 19th centuries are not externality now. In a way, it's a bit the continuation of the comments previously about the institution changing. And I think that this is a major thing because I could see that there are all this change coming in land use, for instance, reconverting retail into something else. And the city is saying, well, yes, we have a commission for that. We are going to look at it. If it takes 10 years to get a permit, to change a type, then it will not happen, and the city will decay. So it's a very, very grave problem, and I'm not sure how they can do it. By the way, the example of Amsterdam, 200 Amsterdam. I don't know if you all know this case. This is a typical thing that I think is extraordinary. A building permit which was revoked, attacked in court, and things like that. I think that's
yeah. And Laura, I want to turn to you. What's your planning message to our to our next mayor?
Yeah, I'll just build on what we've been speaking about here, which is that reallocating streets for people and alternate modes of transportation doesn't need to be an urbanist fantasy, right? And it's proven out through data, not just kind of plans on paper, that it's good for business, it's good for jobs access, it's good for the environment, community cohesion, individuals', health and well-being. And while there might be resistance to start, because to Alain's point, change is hard and bureaucracy change is hard for people. I think Britt made a point earlier about initial resistance. But I think international mayors have proven that you can actually become a beloved, popular mayor who's viewed as a visionary ultimately for making these kinds of decisions. So not only is it good for a city, it's good for your political reputation, I think, long term. And I think that's been something that's been, not viewed as, equivocated. I think New York City is primed to make this step if it wants to. And I think we do need the political will to take that next step.
That's a great point to end us on. Laura, Rit, Henry, Alain, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone tuning in for your questions, for engaging with us. Please subscribe, donate, follow us. We do it thanks to you. And we look forward to being back here with you with more speakers, more great conversations. Thanks again to you, and thank you again to our speakers.
Thank you.